The Forge of the Damned. Chapter 1. The Hammer's Song. The rhythmic clang of hammer against steel had been Gareth's morning song for 3 years now, ever since his father had died of the wasting sickness and left him orphaned at 14. Master Aldrich's forge was a sanctuary of heat and sparks in the cold stone village of Millhaven, where the morning mist clung to thatched roofs like the breath of sleeping giants. Gareth wiped the sweat from his brow with a soot-stained cloth, leaving another dark smear across his already begrimed face. His arms, once thin as reeds, now corded with muscle from countless hours at the anvil. The horseshoe he'd been working glowed orange-hot, its metal singing as he struck it into shape. Each blow was precise, learned through painful trial and error under Aldrich's watchful eye and sharp tongue. "Patience, boy," the old blacksmith would say when Gareth rushed his work. "Iron has its own will. Respect it or it'll crack like your skull when you're not paying attention." The forge occupied the ground floor of a sturdy stone building at the edge of Millhaven's main square. Above it, Gareth slept in a cramped loft that smelled of coal dust and heated metal. The arrangement suited him well enough, better than the alternatives available to an orphan with no coin and no family name to claim. Millhaven itself was nothing remarkable, a village of perhaps 200 souls nestled in a valley between rolling hills. Farmers brought their broken plows and bent horseshoes to Aldrich's forge. The local lord's men-at-arms came for repairs to their mail and weapons. Occasionally, a traveling merchant would need work done on wagon wheels or horse-tack. It was steady work, if not prosperous, and Gareth had found a kind of peace in the predictable rhythm of it. That morning started no different from any other. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from hearth fires and the earthy smell of leaves turning brown. Gareth had risen before dawn to stoke the forge fire, as was his daily duty. By the time Master Aldrich descended from his quarters above the workshop, coals glowed red-hot and ready for the day's work. "We've got Lord Brennan's men coming today," Aldrich announced, scratching his grizzled beard. "Armor repairs and sharpening. Mind you keep the edge true on those blades. They're not for show." Gareth nodded, focusing on the horseshoe as he quenched it in the water barrel. Steam hissed and bubbled as the hot metal touched water, filling the air with acrid vapor. He'd grown skilled at reading the metal's color, knowing exactly when to pull it from the fire and when to let it cool. Lord Brennan ruled the surrounding lands from his keep 3 leagues to the north. His men-at-arms were a hard lot, scarred veterans who'd served in the border wars against neighboring lords. They treated Gareth with the casual indifference reserved for servants, but he'd learned to listen when they talked among themselves. Their conversations often carried news from beyond Millhaven's quiet borders. The first group arrived near midday. 6 men in worn mail hauberks, their surcoats bearing Lord Brennan's device of a silver wolf on blue field. Their sergeant, a grizzled man named Harkon with a prominent scar across his left cheek, carried a bundle of weapons that needed attention. "Usual work, Aldrich," Harkon said, unwrapping swords and daggers on the workshop table. "Nicks in the edges, couple of bent points. Nothing fancy." Gareth studied the weapons as Aldrich examined them. These were working blades, functional rather than decorative. The steel showed wear and use. Tiny nicks along the cutting edge, scratches on the fuller, wear patterns on the grips where hands had gripped them in earnest. Each mark told a story of training or combat. "I will have them ready by tomorrow evening," Aldrich replied. "The boy here does good work with edges now. Learned his lessons well." Harkon glanced at Gareth with mild interest. "That right? How long you been at this, lad?" 3 years, sir," Gareth replied, keeping his voice respectful. "Since Master Aldrich took me on." Harkon picked up one of the swords, testing its balance. "You know which end's which, then. That's more than some can claim." The men-at-arms settled in to wait while Aldrich and Gareth began work on their weapons. As they often did, the soldiers fell into conversation about recent events. Gareth kept his ears open while he worked, filing nicks from a dagger blade. Strangest thing I ever saw, one of the men was saying. Whole village just empty. Not burned, not sacked, just empty. Like everyone up and walked away in the middle of supper. Which village was this? Harkon asked. Oakenford, 2 days' ride east. Lord Brennan sent us to collect taxes, but there was nobody there to collect from. Food still on tables, but gone cold and spoiled. Livestock wandering loose in the fields. Another soldier spat into the forge fire where it sizzled and vanished. Plague, most like. People flee when the sickness comes. Maybe, the first man said doubtfully. But usually you find bodies. This time nothing. Not even bones. Gareth's hands slowed on the dagger as he listened. Villages didn't just empty themselves for no reason. Even in plague times, there were always some who stayed. The old, the sick, the stubborn ones who refused to abandon their homes. Could be bandits, suggested a third soldier. Take the people as slaves, sell them downriver. Bandits would have taken everything of value, Harkon replied. From what you're telling me, they left plenty behind. No, something else happened there. The conversation moved on to other topics. Complaints about rations, speculation about when Lord Brennan might call them to campaign season again, gossip about the Lord's daughter and her prospects for marriage. But Gareth found his thoughts returning to the empty village. Oakenford was close enough that news of its fate would eventually reach Millhaven, if it hadn't already. He mentioned it to Aldrich that evening as they banked the forge fire for the night. The old blacksmith listened thoughtfully, then shook his head. Strange times, Aldrich said finally. My grandfather used to tell stories about such things. Villages found empty, no sign of where the people went. He claimed it was the work of restless dead, but grandfather was known for his tall tales. Restless dead? Bodies that wouldn't stay buried. Walking corpses with an appetite for living flesh. Aldrich chuckled at Gareth's expression. Don't look so worried, lad. Old stories, nothing more. There's always a reasonable explanation for such things. Plague, bandits, war. People disappear for ordinary reasons. But that night, as Gareth lay in his narrow cot in the loft above the forge, he found sleep elusive. Something about the soldier's story troubled him beyond rational explanation. In his mind, he pictured the empty village, tables set for meals that would never be eaten, doors standing open to houses where no one would ever return. The next morning brought more unsettling news. A traveling merchant named Corwin arrived at the forge with a broken axle on his wagon. While Aldrich worked on repairs, the merchant shared rumors he'd collected from other villages along his route. It's spreading, Corwin said, accepting a cup of ale from Gareth. Started with Oakenford, but now there's talk of other places gone empty. Greystone Mill, Haven's Cross. Always the same. People vanish without trace, leaving everything behind. How many villages? Aldrich asked, not looking up from his work on the axle. 5, maybe 6. Hard to get reliable word. People are scared, sticking close to home. Trade suffering for it. Gareth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. 6 villages, all emptied in the same mysterious way. That was beyond coincidence. Any survivors found? He asked. Anyone who escaped to tell what happened? Corwin shook his head. That's the strangest part. Usually when disaster strikes, you get refugees streaming out. This time, nothing. It's like the ground opened up and swallowed them whole. The merchant finished his ale and departed once his wagon was repaired, but his words lingered in the forge like smoke from green wood. Gareth found himself watching the roads leading into Millhaven, wondering if whatever had claimed those other villages might be moving this way. His unease grew over the following days as more disturbing reports filtered in. Father Marcus, the village priest, mentioned during his weekly visit that he'd received no word from several parishes in the affected area. Unusual, since the church maintained regular correspondence between its various holdings. Bishop Aldwyn is concerned, the priest confided to Aldrich while Gareth sharpened a ceremonial sword used in religious ceremonies. He's sent riders to investigate, but none have returned with word. How long since they left? Aldrich asked. A week passed, long enough to reach the affected areas and return, if they found nothing amiss. That night, Gareth dreamed of empty villages and silent streets. In his dream, he walked through Millhaven's main square, but the houses stood vacant and doors creaked open in the wind. He called out, but his voice echoed unanswered off stone walls. When he turned to flee, shadows moved at the edge of his vision. Dark shapes that might have been human if humans could move with such unnatural, jerky motions. He woke with a start, heart pounding. Outside, Millhaven slept peacefully under a blanket of stars. But Gareth could not shake the feeling that something was coming for them all. The first concrete sign of trouble arrived 3 days later, in the form of a lone horseman who thundered into the village square at midday, his mount lathered with sweat and foam. Gareth was delivering a repaired plough blade to Farmer Willem when the rider appeared, and both men paused their conversation to watch. The horseman wore the colors of Lord Brennan, the same silver wolf device Gareth had seen on the soldiers' surcoats. But this man looked like he'd ridden through hell itself. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with barely contained terror. Dark stains marked his surcoat, and Gareth realized with a start that they looked like dried blood. "Where's your head man?" the rider called out to the gathering crowd. "I bring word from Lord Brennan." Thomas Miller, who served as Millhaven's unofficial leader, stepped forward. "I speak for the village. What word do you bring?" The rider dismounted on unsteady legs, his horse shying nervously as if sensing its master's fear. "The Lord is dead," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Dead, and his keep overrun. I'm the only one who escaped." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Lord Brennan had ruled these lands for 30 years, a hard man but a capable one. If he was dead, what did that mean for the villages under his protection? "How?" Thomas Miller asked. "Raiders? Rival lords?" The rider shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Not raiders, not men at all. The dead rose up and walked. They came in the night, hundreds of them. Bodies that should have been rotting in the ground, moving like they were alive, but wrong. All wrong." Several people in the crowd made the sign against evil. Father Marcus pushed through to the front, his face grave. "You speak of the restless dead," the priest said. "Are you certain of what you saw?" "I saw Sergeant Harkon torn apart by 3 corpses wearing the faces of his own dead soldiers," the rider replied, his voice breaking. "I saw my lord fight with sword and flame against things that should have died from their wounds but kept coming. I saw—" He paused, struggling for words. "I saw hell itself spill forth upon the earth." Gareth felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Harkon, the scarred sergeant who'd brought weapons to the forge just days ago. Dead now, according to this lone survivor. "What of the other villages?" Father Marcus asked. "The empty ones we've heard tell of." "Not empty," the rider said. "The people are still there, but they're not people anymore. They've joined the horde of walking dead. Every village that falls adds to their numbers. They're coming this way, following the road south. You have perhaps 2 days before they reach Millhaven." The crowd erupted in frightened voices, some calling for immediate flight, others demanding more details, still others denying that such things could be possible. Thomas Miller raised his hands for quiet. "If what you say is true," Miller said to the rider, "then we need to decide quickly what to do. Do we flee or do we fight?" "Flee," the rider said without hesitation. "You cannot fight the dead. Steel passes through them like mist, and they feel no pain. They'll keep coming until they drag you down and add you to their numbers." "Where would we go?" asked Widow Enna, clutching her 2 young children close. "If they're spreading south along the roads, where is safe?" The rider had no answer for that. Neither did anyone else. Gareth slipped away from the crowd and returned to the forge, his mind racing. 2 days before the dead arrived in Millhaven, if the rider spoke truth. 2 days to decide between flight and a hopeless fight. He found Aldrich sitting at his workbench, carefully honing the edge of a long sword. The old blacksmith looked up as Gareth entered. "You heard?" Aldrich asked. "I heard. Do you believe it?" Aldrich tested the sword's edge with his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. "I believe that boy saw something that scared him near to madness. Whether it was walking corpses or just desperate men in the dark, well, does it matter? Either way, danger's coming to Millhaven. What do we do?" The old blacksmith set down his sharpening stone and looked at Gareth seriously. "We have a choice to make, lad. Pack what we can carry and take to the roads, hoping to stay ahead of whatever's coming. Or stand and fight for the only home either of us has left." Gareth thought of the empty villages, their people vanished or worse. He thought of Millhaven's children, the families who'd lived here for generations, the simple life he'd built in the 3 years since his father's death. Could he simply abandon it all? "The rider said steel passes through them like mist," Gareth said. "How do you fight something that can't be cut?" Aldrich smiled grimly and picked up the sword he'd been sharpening. "Maybe you can't cut them, but fire burns anything that was ever alive, and a heavy enough blow will break bones, dead or living. Besides, ... He gestured around the forge. "We know metalwork better than most. If there's a way to forge weapons that can hurt the dead, we'll find it." That evening, the village held an emergency council in the square. Perhaps half the population had already decided to flee, packing what belongings they could carry and preparing to take the roads at first light. The other half, mostly the older residents with deep roots in Millhaven, chose to stay and defend their homes. Gareth listened to the arguments from both sides. Those who favored flight pointed out that the rider had specifically warned against fighting the dead. Those who chose to stand argued that fleeing would only delay the inevitable. If the plague of walking corpses continued to spread, there would be nowhere left to run. When the debate finally ended, perhaps 70 people had committed to staying and fighting. Among them were most of the village's craftsmen, the miller, the carpenter, the tanner, and of course Aldrich and Gareth. Also staying were a handful of men with military experience, veterans of various wars who'd settled in Millhaven to live out their years in peace. "We'll need weapons," announced Willem Carpenter, who'd emerged as the leader of those staying behind. "Armor if we can manage it. Whatever we can craft in the time we have." All eyes turned to Aldrich, as the village's only blacksmith. The old man nodded slowly. "We'll work through the night," he promised. "Every scrap of iron in the village, turned to some useful purpose. But I'll need help, more hands than just my apprentice here." Several men volunteered immediately. Gareth felt a surge of pride as he realized they'd be looking to him to help teach basic metalworking techniques. 3 years of training were about to be put to the ultimate test. As the crowd dispersed to make their final preparations, Gareth found himself standing alone with Aldrich in the square. The old blacksmith placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Last chance to change your mind, lad," Aldrich said quietly. "You're young yet, with years ahead of you. Nobody would think less if you chose to run." Gareth looked around the square, at the houses where he'd delivered finished metalwork, at the well where he'd drawn water every morning, at the church where he'd attended services since childhood. 3 years ago, Millhaven had given him a home when he had nothing. How could he abandon it now? "I'm staying," he said firmly. "This is my home, too." Aldrich smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "Then we'd best get to work. We have a long night ahead of us, and longer days to follow." They walked back to the forge together, their shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Behind them, families said their farewells as some prepared to flee and others prepared to fight. Ahead lay the unknown, whether the shambling dead were real or merely the fevered imaginings of a terrified soldier. But real or not, Millhaven would be ready for them. Chapter 2. The Longest Night. The forge had never seen such frantic activity. By the light of torches and oil lamps, a dozen men worked through the night, turning every scrap of metal in Millhaven into weapons. Gareth found himself thrust into the role of teacher, showing farmers and craftsmen how to hold a hammer properly, how to read the color of heated steel, how to quench a blade without cracking it. "Keep the angle steady," he instructed Willem Carpenter, who was attempting to sharpen a makeshift spear point. "Too steep and you'll chip the edge. Too shallow and it won't cut." The carpenter nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. Around them, other men worked at various tasks, some maintaining the forge fire, others grinding edges on newly forged blades, still others fitting handles to improvised weapons. Aldrich moved between the workstations like a general commanding troops, offering advice and correction where needed. His decades of experience showed in every gesture as he demonstrated techniques that normally took months to master. "Remember?" the old blacksmith called out to the group. "We're not making pretty things here. Function over form. A ugly blade that cuts is worth 10 beautiful ones that break in your hand." They worked with whatever metal they could find. Iron wagon wheels were heated and reforged into spear points. Kitchen knives were lengthened into short swords. Agricultural tools became weapons of war. Pitchforks sharpened to deadly points. Scythes straightened into makeshift halberds. Not everything they attempted succeeded. Marcus Webb, a young farmer with more enthusiasm than skill, cracked 2 spear points before Gareth gently moved him to maintaining the fire instead. But gradually, a respectable arsenal took shape. As dawn approached, exhaustion weighed heavy on all of them. Gareth's arms ached from hours of hammering, and his hands were raw despite his calluses. But they'd managed to arm most of the 70 defenders with at least basic weapons. "Not bad for one night's work," Aldrich admitted, surveying their handiwork as the first pale light crept through the forge windows. "Though I'd feel better if we had another week." "Will they hold up in battle?" asked Peter Stone, examining a spear he'd helped craft. "They'll serve," Aldrich replied. "Just remember, these aren't parade weapons. Use them hard and they'll break eventually. Try to have a backup ready." Outside, the village stirred to life as those who'd chosen to flee made their final preparations. Gareth watched from the forge doorway as families loaded carts with belongings, preparing to take the southern road toward the larger town of Redbridge. Among those leaving were the Bakers, a family with 3 young children, and several of the older villagers who couldn't be expected to fight. Gareth didn't blame them for going. If half the stories about the Walking Dead were true, Millhaven was about to become a very dangerous place. "Should we have gone with them?" asked young Tom Miller, the headman's son who'd stayed behind against his father's wishes. "Maybe," Gareth admitted, "but someone has to make a stand somewhere. If we all just keep running, where does it end?" By mid-morning, the exodus was complete. The village felt eerily quiet with nearly half its population gone. Those who remained began the grim work of preparing defenses. Willem Carpenter led a team in building barricades across the main roads into the village. They used whatever they could find: overturned carts, piles of stones, sharpened stakes driven into the ground. The barriers wouldn't stop a determined assault, but they might slow attackers and funnel them into killing zones. Meanwhile, Father Marcus organized the storage of food and water in the church, which was deemed the strongest building in Millhaven. If the outer defenses fell, the survivors would make their final stand there. Gareth spent the day helping to distribute weapons and teaching basic combat techniques to those who'd never held a sword. His own training was limited. Aldrich had shown him some basics over the years, and he'd learned more by watching the soldiers who visited the forge. But among Millhaven's remaining defenders, even limited knowledge made him something of an expert. "Don't try to be fancy," he told a group gathered in the square. "Keep your guard up, aim for center mass, And remember that in a real fight, everything happens fast. Don't think too much. Trust your instincts and keep moving. He demonstrated a few simple cuts and blocks, then had the men practice on straw targets. Most were clumsy at first, but they showed determination to learn. That might count for more than skill when the time came. As afternoon faded toward evening, scouts reported movement on the northern road. The dead were coming. Gareth climbed to the roof of the church's bell tower alongside Father Marcus, carrying a spyglass borrowed from a traveling merchant. Through the lens, he could see them in the distance, a dark mass moving along the road like a slow-flowing river. "How many?" the priest asked. Gareth tried to count but gave up after reaching 50. The horde stretched back along the road farther than he could see clearly. "Hundreds," he said finally. "Maybe more." Even through the spyglass, they looked wrong somehow. Their movement was shambling and uneven, like marionettes worked by drunken puppeteers. Some moved faster than others, but all shared the same jerky, unnatural gait. "God preserve us," Father Marcus whispered. The rider spoke truth. They climbed down to spread the word. Within minutes, church bells were ringing throughout the valley, the agreed-upon signal for the surrounding area to take warning. Whether anyone remained alive to hear them was another question. The final preparations were completed in grim haste. Every defender took position at the barricades or in buildings overlooking the main square. Gareth found himself assigned to the northern barricade alongside Aldrich and a dozen other men. "Remember what we practiced," Willem Carpenter called out as the shambling horde drew closer. "Let them break themselves against the barriers. Use your reach. Keep them at spear point if you can." The sun was setting behind the hills when the first of the walking dead reached Millhaven's outskirts. In the fading light, their condition became horribly clear. These had once been people, farmers and craftsmen, soldiers and merchants, women and children. But death had changed them into something else entirely. Their skin was gray and mottled, their eyes clouded with cataracts. Many showed grievous wounds that should have been fatal, torn throats, gaping chest wounds, limbs hanging by strips of flesh. Yet they moved with purpose, drawn by some instinct toward the living defenders. And they made sounds, not quite human voices, but a constant low moaning that raised the hair on the back of Gareth's neck. "Hold steady," Aldrich called softly from beside him. "Wait for them to reach the stakes." The first wave of dead reached the barricade and immediately began trying to climb over it. The sharpened stakes impaled several, but the creatures seemed to feel no pain. Those that weren't skewered simply climbed over the bodies of those that were. "Now!" Willem shouted. The defenders struck with spears and improvised polearms, trying to keep the dead at a distance. Gareth thrust his spear into the chest of what had once been a young woman, feeling the point scrape against ribs. The creature barely seemed to notice, continuing to claw its way forward even with 3 feet of steel through its torso. He jerked the spear free and struck again, this time at the thing's neck. The blade bit deep, nearly severing the head, and finally the creature collapsed. "The neck!" he shouted to the others. "Cut the neck or take the head!" Around him, the other defenders were learning the same lesson through bloody trial and error. Peter Stone screamed as a corpse grabbed his spear and pulled him forward into its embrace. Before Gareth could help, the thing's teeth found Stone's throat. But Peter's sacrifice wasn't in vain. His death taught the others to be more careful about keeping their distance. They began working more methodically, using the reach of their weapons to strike at necks and heads while staying out of grasping range. The battle settled into a grim rhythm. The dead came forward in waves, climbing over their fallen comrades to reach the barricade. The defenders struck them down, but each kill seemed to cost more effort than the last. And always, more kept coming. "How many of these damn things are there?" gasped Tom Miller, pausing to wipe sweat from his eyes. "All of them," Aldrich replied grimly. "Every village they've taken, every person they've killed. They all join the horde. That sobering thought drove home the true horror of their situation. This wasn't just a battle, it was a race against time. Every defender who fell would rise again as an enemy. Every village that was overrun would swell the ranks of the dead. The northern barricade held for perhaps an hour before sheer numbers began to tell. Bodies of the slain dead were piled so high that the living ones could simply walk over them. And the defenders' makeshift weapons were beginning to fail under the strain. Gareth's spear point had broken off after striking a skull at the wrong angle. He'd switched to a backup, a long-handled hammer that Aldrich had forged that morning. It was effective at crushing skulls, but required him to get dangerously close to his targets. "Fall back!" Willem called out as the line began to buckle. "Secondary positions!" The defenders abandoned the northern barricade in good order, retreating to prepared positions around the main square. But they'd lost 4 men in the fighting, and Gareth watched in horror as those bodies began to twitch and move. "They're getting up!" young Tom Miller cried out in panic. "Burn them!" Father Marcus shouted from the church steps. "Fire purifies the corrupt flesh." Several defenders hurled torches at the rising corpses. The flames caught quickly on their clothes and dried flesh, and the burning bodies collapsed again, apparently permanently this time. "Fire works," Aldrich observed, "but we haven't got enough torches to burn them all." The dead poured into the main square like a dark tide. In the flickering light of torches and burning buildings, their numbers seemed endless. The defenders had perhaps 50 men left, facing hundreds of walking corpses. "The church," Willem ordered. "Final stand at the church." But even as the words left his mouth, Gareth could see it was hopeless. The dead were already circling behind them, cutting off the retreat. They were surrounded. That was when young Tom Miller did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. Drawing a sword he barely knew how to use, the boy charged into the thickest part of the horde. "For Millhaven!" he screamed, cutting down 3 of the dead before they overwhelmed him. His sacrifice created a gap in their ranks, just enough for a few more defenders to reach the church. But Tom himself was lost, dragged down under a pile of grasping corpses. Gareth found himself fighting back-to-back with Aldrich near the village well. His hammer rose and fell in steady rhythm, caving in skulls and shattering bones. But for every corpse he dropped, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Lad," Aldrich said during a brief lull in the fighting, "it's been an honor knowing you." "Likewise, Master," Gareth replied, readying his weapon as another wave approached. They might have held their position indefinitely, but Gareth's hammer finally broke under the strain. The handle snapped clean through as he brought it down on a corpse's skull, leaving him weaponless among the dead. A grasping hand seized his shoulder. Yellowed teeth snapped inches from his face. He grabbed the creature's wrist and tried to break free, but more hands grabbed him from behind. Then Aldrich was there, his sword sweeping in a wide arc that took the heads off 3 corpses at once. The old blacksmith hauled Gareth to his feet and pressed a dagger into his hand. "Stay close," Aldrich commanded. "We're going to try for the church." They fought their way step by step across the square, leaving a trail of twice-dead corpses behind them. But there were simply too many enemies. Aldrich took a deep cut across his forearm, then another across his back. Blood loss was slowing him down. "Go!" the old man gasped, pushing Gareth toward the church doors. "I'll hold them here. I'm not leaving you." "You're not leaving me," Aldrich said firmly. "You're going to survive this and carry word to others. Someone has to know what happened here." Before Gareth could argue further, a massive corpse, what had once been a blacksmith like themselves, judging by its size and the leather apron still hanging from its waist, charged them with surprising speed. Aldrich met its rush with his sword, running the blade deep into its chest. But the corpse didn't slow down. It barreled into the old blacksmith, bearing him to the ground under its weight. As Gareth watched in horror, the thing's teeth found Aldrich's throat. "Master!" Gareth lunged forward with his dagger, but other corpses blocked his path. He fought desperately to reach Aldrich, but it was already too late. The old man's struggles had ceased. Then Aldrich's eyes opened again, but they were the clouded, vacant eyes of the dead. The man who had been like a father to Gareth for 3 years shambled to its feet and turned toward him with hungry intent. Gareth ran. He burst through the church doors to find the surviving defenders making their final stand. Perhaps 20 men remained, arranged in a rough circle around the altar. Father Marcus stood in the center, clutching a silver cross and reciting prayers in a voice that shook with terror. "The doors!" Willem Carpenter shouted. "Bar the doors!" But even as Gareth slammed the heavy oak doors shut and dropped the bar into place, he could hear the dead pressing against them from outside. The wood groaned under their weight. "How long will it hold?" someone asked. "Not long enough," Willem replied grimly. They were trapped. Outside, hundreds of walking corpses pressed against the church walls. The sounds of breaking glass came from the windows as the dead tried to force their way in. "There has to be another way out," Gareth said desperately. "A back door, a tunnel, something." Father Marcus shook his head. "The church has but one entrance. We built it that way for defense against raiders, never thinking we might need to escape rather than keep others out." A window shutter splintered, and gray hands reached through the gap. 2 defenders rushed to beat them back, but more windows were failing around the perimeter. "We could try fighting our way out," suggested one of the men. "All together, in a group." "To what end?" Willem asked. "There's nowhere left to run. The dead are everywhere." That was when Gareth noticed the barrels stacked near the altar, oil for the church lamps, pitch for waterproofing the roof, even some strong spirits that Father Marcus used for medicinal purposes. All of it highly flammable. An idea began to form in his mind. A terrible idea, but perhaps their only chance. "Father," he said quietly, "how much oil do you have stored here?" The priest looked puzzled. "Perhaps a dozen barrels. Why do you—" Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Number absolutely not. This is God's house. And God would want us to destroy it rather than let it fall to the servants of evil," Gareth replied. "You know I'm right." The debate was settled when the main doors finally gave way. Dead poured through the entrance like water through a broken dam. The remaining defenders formed up for their final fight. But Gareth was already moving. He grabbed one of the oil barrels and began pouring its contents across the floor, working his way toward the doors. The other men understood his plan and began doing the same. "Light the oil!" he shouted, drawing his dagger and preparing to meet the rush of corpses. "Burn it all!" Father Marcus threw his torch onto the spreading pool of oil. Flames raced across the floor with a roar like a living thing, catching the wooden pews and climbing toward the rafters. The dead pressed forward into the fire, their dried flesh catching like tinder. The heat was immediate and overwhelming. Gareth felt his eyebrows singe as flames licked at the ceiling. Around him, the surviving defenders fought desperately in the growing inferno, striking down burning corpses even as smoke filled their lungs. "The roof!" Willem shouted, pointing upward. "It's going to collapse!" Burning timbers were already falling. One crashed down near the altar, sending up a shower of sparks. Another landed among a group of corpses, crushing them beneath its weight. Gareth found himself separated from the others by a wall of flame. Through the smoke and fire, he could see shapes moving, both living and dead, becoming harder to distinguish in the chaos. The church had become a furnace, consuming everything within its walls. A burning corpse stumbled toward him, its clothes and hair wreathed in flames, but its purpose unchanged. Gareth drove his dagger into its skull, then had to roll aside as another burning timber crashed down where he'd been standing. The smoke was getting thicker. Each breath burned his lungs. Around him, the screams of the dying mixed with the roar of flames and the groaning of tortured wood. He could no longer see the other defenders clearly. just shapes moving in the orange hell the church had become. That was when part of the roof gave way entirely. A section of burning rafters crashed down near the altar, taking half the ceiling with it. Fresh air rushed in through the gap, feeding the flames to even greater heights. But the collapse had also created an opening. Gareth looked up and saw night sky through the hole in the roof. It was a slim chance, but perhaps the only one left. He sheathed his dagger and began climbing over the wreckage, ignoring the heat that seared his hands and face. Behind him, the church continued its collapse into ruin. The dead were burning now, their moans growing fainter as the flames consumed them. Gareth hauled himself up onto what remained of the roof, his clothes smoking from the heat below. Around him, the night air felt wonderfully cool after the inferno of the church interior. But his relief was short-lived. The entire village was burning. Every building showed flames or the glow of fire within. The dead wandered through the streets like living torches, their burning forms casting dancing shadows on the walls. And there were so many of them. Even with the losses from the church fire, hundreds of corpses still roamed through Millhaven. The horde had grown during the battle, fed by the bodies of fallen defenders who'd risen again to join their killers. Gareth crouched on the burning roof, watching his home die. Every building held memories. The baker's shop where he'd bought his weekly bread, the well where he'd drawn water each morning, the forge where he'd learned his trade. All of it was burning now, or soon would be. But he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he'd survived when so many others hadn't. The question was, what to do with that survival? The southern road was still relatively clear. Most of the dead seemed focused on the burning village. If he could reach the ground and move carefully, he might be able to slip away into the darkness. He could follow the road toward Redbridge, perhaps catch up with the refugees who'd fled that morning. It would be the sensible thing to do, the smart thing, the safe thing. But as Gareth watched the flames consume his home, he found himself thinking about the refugees. They'd taken the southern road, but if the dead continued to spread, how long before they were caught as well? How long before Redbridge faced the same fate as Millhaven? Someone had to warn them. Someone had to spread word of what was coming. The rider from Lord Brennan's keep had tried, but one man's testimony could be dismissed as madness or exaggeration. It would take more than that to convince people to take the threat seriously. Gareth made his decision. He would follow the refugees to Redbridge, but not to hide among them. He would tell them what he'd seen, what he'd learned about fighting the dead. He would help them prepare for what was coming, if they would listen. The roof was growing too hot to remain on much longer. Gareth worked his way to the edge and looked down. The drop was perhaps 15 feet to the ground. Survivable, if he landed right. Below, scattered corpses wandered through the smoke-filled streets, but none seemed to be looking up. He took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and jumped. The landing drove the breath from his lungs and sent spikes of pain through his legs, but nothing seemed broken. He rolled to absorb the impact, then lay still for a moment, listening for any sign that his descent had been noticed. Nothing. The dead continued their aimless wandering, drawn by the flames and the scent of burning flesh rather than any awareness of his presence. Gareth rose carefully to his feet and began making his way toward the southern edge of the village. He moved from shadow to shadow, staying low and avoiding the main streets where the dead were thickest. Once he had to freeze against a wall as a group of corpses shambled past, but they didn't notice him. The smith's shop was completely engulfed in flames when he passed it. Through the broken windows, he could see the forge itself glowing cherry red from the heat. 3 years of his life, burning away to nothing. But he couldn't afford to mourn now. Survival demanded movement, and movement demanded focus. He pushed his grief aside and continued toward the edge of town. The last building he passed was the mill house, where the headman Thomas Miller had lived with his family. The front door stood open, and in the flickering light from nearby fires, Gareth could see bodies scattered across the threshold. The Millers had chosen to stay and fight, like so many others, like his master Aldrich. Gareth forced himself to keep moving. The southern road lay just ahead, winding away from Millhaven toward the larger world beyond. Behind him, his home burned under a sky made orange by flames and smoke. But he was alive, and that meant he had work to do. Chapter 3. The Final Stand. The road to Redbridge stretched for 2 days through rolling hills and scattered farmsteads. Gareth made the journey in half that time, driven by urgency and the knowledge that the dead would not be far behind. He slept little, ate less, and pushed himself beyond the limits of normal endurance. The refugees from Millhaven had made camp in a grove of oak trees about a mile from Redbridge's walls. Gareth found them there on the afternoon of his second day of travel, huddled around cook fires and speaking in hushed, frightened voices. Many were people he'd known his entire life, but the haunted look in their eyes made them seem like strangers. "Gareth!" Widow Enna called out when she spotted him approaching. "Thank the gods you're alive. We feared the worst when we saw the smoke." Indeed, the smoke from Millhaven's burning was visible even at this distance, a dark smudge against the afternoon sky that told its own grim story. The refugees had been watching it with growing despair, knowing that their homes were gone forever. "What happened?" asked Baker Corwin, rising from his place beside a fire. "Did anyone else escape?" Gareth shook his head slowly. "I'm the only one. The dead came in numbers beyond counting. We fought them through the night, but..." He spread his hands helplessly. "There were too many." A woman began to weep quietly. A man cursed and threw his hat to the ground. Children pressed closer to their parents, sensing the adults' fear, even if they didn't fully understand its source. "The rider spoke truth then," said Merchant Aldwyn, who'd been among the first to leave Millhaven. "The dead truly walk. They walk and they kill, and they turn the living into more of their kind," Gareth confirmed. "Every village they take adds to their strength, and they're coming this way." That set off a round of frightened murmurs. Several people began talking about leaving immediately, pressing on toward the capital city far to the south. Others argued for seeking shelter within Redbridge's walls. "We need to warn the town," Gareth said firmly. "They have to know what's coming." "Who would believe such a tale?" asked Corwin. "Walking dead armies of corpses? It sounds like something from a children's ghost story." "Then we make them believe," Gareth replied. "We show them the smoke from Millhaven. We tell them what we've seen, and we help them prepare." But when they approached Redbridge's gates the next morning, they found the town's leaders less than receptive to their warnings. Mayor Blackwood, a prosperous merchant who'd grown fat on trade between the capital and the northern provinces, listened to their story with barely concealed skepticism. "You're telling me that Lord Brennan is dead?" the mayor asked, leaning back in his chair. "That his keep was overrun by walking corpses?" "I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes," Gareth replied. "The dead rose from their graves and walked among the living. They killed everyone in their path and turned them into more of their kind." "Preposterous," scoffed Captain Hendricks, the commander of Redbridge's town guard. "Dead bodies don't get up and walk around. This is some sort of hysteria brought on by shock and grief." "Then explain the smoke from Millhaven," Gareth challenged. "Explain the empty villages. Explain why no word has come from the northern provinces in days." The mayor and captain exchanged glances. They clearly didn't believe the stories about walking dead, but they couldn't easily dismiss the evidence of widespread destruction in the north. "Even if something catastrophic has happened," Mayor Blackwood said finally, "it's more likely to be plague or war than supernatural monsters. We'll send riders north to investigate." "Don't send them alone," Gareth warned. Send them in groups, well armed, with orders to flee at the first sign of danger. Tell them to return quickly. You'll need every man you can get for the defense of this town." But the mayor was already dismissing them with a wave of his hand. "Thank you for your warnings. We'll take them under advisement. Captain Hendricks will see that you and your people are given temporary shelter in the refugee camp outside town." The refugee camp was a sprawling collection of tents and improvised shelters that had grown up around Redbridge over the past week. It housed not only the survivors from Millhaven, but displaced people from several other northern villages. All told, perhaps 300 souls with nowhere else to go. Gareth walked among them, listening to their stories. They all followed the same pattern. Villages found empty, populations vanished without trace, an inexplicable sense of dread that had driven people to flee their homes even when they couldn't explain why. "It's spreading," he told the small group of refugees who'd gathered around his campfire that evening. "Moving south along the main roads, Redbridge is directly in its path." "How long do we have?" asked Widow Enna, clutching her 2 young children close. "A day, maybe 2. The dead move slowly, but they don't stop to rest. They'll be here soon enough." "Then we should leave," said Baker Corwin. "Pack up and keep moving south." "To where?" Gareth asked. "How far south do we run? And what happens to the people of Redbridge when the dead arrive?" That question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Everyone knew the answer, even if they didn't want to voice it. If the dead took Redbridge, its population would swell their ranks by thousands. The horde would grow beyond any hope of containment. "Someone has to make a stand," Gareth said quietly. "Someone has to fight back, or this plague will spread until it consumes everything." "You're talking about a battle we can't even win," pointed out Merchant Aldwin. "You saw what happened to Millhaven. What chance does Redbridge have?" "Maybe none," Gareth admitted. "But we have to try, because if we don't, then everyone dies anyway, just a little later and a little farther south." The next morning brought grim news. The riders Mayor Blackwood had sent north had returned with reports of devastation along the main roads. Whole villages stood empty, their buildings intact but their people gone. And something was indeed moving south. A large group of some kind, too distant to make out clearly, but headed directly for Redbridge. This time, when Gareth and the other refugees were brought before the town council, the officials listened with considerably more attention. "How do we fight them?" Captain Hendricks asked bluntly. "If what you're saying is true, how do we kill things that are already dead?" "Fireworks," Gareth replied, "and heavy blows to the head or neck. You can't kill them the way you'd kill a living man. They feel no pain, they don't bleed to death, they don't tire, but you can destroy them." "How many are we talking about?" Gareth thought back to the horde he'd seen at Millhaven. Hundreds, certainly. Maybe thousands by now. Every village they've taken has added to their numbers. Captain Hendricks paled. "We have perhaps 200 men in the town guard, and maybe half that number of civilians with military experience, against thousands. You'll need every advantage you can get," Gareth said. "Defensive positions, choke points, barriers to funnel them into killing zones, and fire, lots of fire." "What about the refugees?" Mayor Blackwood asked. "The people in the camps?" "Evacuate them further south," Gareth suggested. "They'll only be in the way during the fighting, and if the town falls, they'll just add to the enemy's numbers." But even as he said it, Gareth knew it was too late for large-scale evacuation. The dead would be here within hours, and moving 300 frightened refugees along crowded roads would take days. Most would be caught in the open, defenseless. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the lookouts on Redbridge's walls spotted movement on the northern road. A dark mass, flowing like a sluggish river, headed directly for the town. The horde had arrived. Gareth stood on the town's walls alongside Captain Hendricks and the other defenders, watching the approaching enemy through a borrowed spyglass. In the distance, the shambling figures looked almost human, until you noticed their unnatural gait, their tattered clothing, the way they moved without any apparent coordination or purpose beyond the drive to reach the living. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered one of the guardsmen. "There are so many of them." The horde stretched back along the road as far as the eye could see. Gareth tried to count them, but gave up after reaching 500. There might be 1,000 or 2,000 or more. Enough to overwhelm Redbridge's defenses through sheer numbers. "Orders, Captain?" asked Sergeant Morris, the grizzled veteran who served as Hendrix's second-in-command. "Positions," Hendrix replied, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Everyone to their assigned posts. And remember, aim for the heads and necks. Body wounds won't stop them." The defenders moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. Archers took position along the walls, their quivers full of arrows that had been hastily modified with broader heads for maximum damage. Spearmen lined the parapets, ready to thrust down at any dead that reached the walls. Below, more defenders waited behind improvised barricades in the streets. Gareth had been assigned to the main gate, where the heaviest fighting was expected. He carried a weapon of his own making, a heavy war hammer with a spike on the reverse side, forged from the finest steel he could find. It wasn't pretty, but it would serve to crush skulls and pierce bone. The dead reached the outer buildings of Redbridge just as the sun touched the horizon. They flowed around the structures like water around stones, showing no interest in the empty buildings. Their entire focus was on the walls ahead, where living defenders waited. "Archers!" Captain Hendrix called out. "Loose!" The first volley of arrows arced over the walls and into the approaching horde. Dozens of shafts found their marks, and perhaps a third of those struck heads or necks with enough force to drop their targets. The rest simply sprouted from torsos and limbs, causing no apparent harm. The dead continued their advance, climbing over the bodies of the fallen without pause. A second volley brought down more, but it was like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. For every corpse that fell, 10 more took its place. Then they reached the walls. The siege of Redbridge began with a sound like breaking waves as hundreds of dead bodies pressed against the stone fortifications. They climbed over each other in their eagerness to reach the living, creating pyramids of writhing corpses that grew taller with each passing moment. "Spears!" Hendrix shouted. "Keep them off the walls!" The defenders thrust downward with their long weapons, trying to knock the climbing dead back to the ground. But there were too many, coming from too many directions. Here and there, grayish hands appeared at the top of the wall, followed by the vacant faces of the risen dead. Gareth's hammer rose and fell in steady rhythm, crushing skulls and sending corpses tumbling back into the crowd below. But each one he struck down was immediately replaced by another. The pile of bodies at the base of the wall grew steadily higher. "They're going to overtop us," Sergeant Morris called out, his voice tight with strain. "There's too many of them." That was when Captain Hendrix made a decision that would be remembered for generations, if anyone survived to remember it. He ordered the use of the town's most precious resource, the oil reserves that were meant to last through the coming winter. "Bring up the oil," he commanded. "All of it. We'll burn them off the walls." Barrels of lamp oil were rolled to the parapets, and their contents poured down onto the mass of dead bodies below. The oil soaked into their dried flesh and tattered clothing, creating perfect conditions for what came next. "Fire arrows!" Hendrix shouted. The archers lit their arrows and sent them arcing into the oil-soaked crowd. The result was immediate and spectacular. Flames raced through the packed bodies like a living thing, turning the base of the wall into a sea of fire. The burning dead continued to press forward, their flames spreading to others around them. Soon, hundreds of corpses were blazing like torches, yet still they tried to climb the walls. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, so thick and cloying that many defenders had to retreat from the walls to vomit. But the fire was working. The dead at the base of the wall were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. The pressure on the defenses began to ease. "It's working!" someone shouted. "The fire's turning them back!" But Gareth knew better. He'd seen how many dead were in the horde, and this was only the first wave. The flames would burn themselves out eventually, and when they did, more corpses would take the place of those that had been destroyed. Still, the reprieve gave the defenders time to regroup and tend their wounded. Several men had been pulled from the walls by grasping hands, but most had been rescued before the dead could complete their kills. "How much oil do we have left?" Hendricks asked his supply sergeant. "Perhaps half, sir. We used most of it in that first attack." The captain nodded grimly. "Then we'll have to use it wisely. Save it for when they break through." As if summoned by his words, shouts arose from the eastern wall. The dead had found a section where the defenses were thinner, and they were pouring over the ramparts in growing numbers. "Reserves to the east wall!" Hendricks commanded. "Move!" Gareth ran with the other reserves toward the breach, his hammer ready. They arrived to find chaos. Defenders fighting desperately against corpses that had already gained the walkway atop the wall. More dead were climbing up behind them, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Form up!" Sergeant Morris shouted. "Shield wall!" The defenders locked their shields together and advanced as a unit, pushing the dead back toward the wall's edge. Gareth fought behind the shield line, his hammer reaching over the defenders' heads to crush any skull that came within range. But they were losing ground. The dead felt no fear, no pain, no exhaustion. They pressed forward with mindless determination, and gradually the shield wall began to buckle under the pressure. "Fall back," Morris commanded. "Fighting withdrawal to the stairs." The retreat was a nightmare of confusion and terror. Soldiers tried to maintain formation while walking backward down narrow stone steps, fighting off grasping hands and snapping teeth. Several men were pulled from the line and dragged down under piles of corpses, but they made it to the bottom of the wall, where broader streets allowed them to reform their line. Here, other defenders joined them, civilians armed with whatever weapons they could find, fighting for their homes and families. The battle for Redbridge's streets had begun. What followed was the longest night of Gareth's life. The fighting moved from street to street, building to building, as the dead poured through the breached walls in ever greater numbers. The defenders fell back step by step, making the corpses pay for every yard of ground. Gareth lost track of how many dead he'd killed. His hammer grew slick with dark blood and bits of brain matter. His arms ached from the constant swinging, and his lungs burned from the smoke that filled the air. Around him the town burned as the fighting spread fires from building to building. By midnight, the defenders had been pushed back to the town square. Perhaps 50 men remained of the original garrison, plus a handful of armed civilians. They formed a rough circle around the fountain at the square's center, facing outward toward the masses of dead that pressed in from all sides. "Is this it?" asked one of the younger guards, his voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "This is it," Captain Hendricks confirmed. "We've given them a fight they won't forget." But even as he spoke, Gareth could see more dead pouring into the square. They came from every street and alley, their numbers seemingly endless. The final assault was about to begin. That was when Gareth made his own decision, one that would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. He looked around at the exhausted defenders, at the terrified civilians, at the children who'd been caught in the town when the attack began. All of them would die in the next few minutes. All of them would rise again as enemies, unless someone prevented it. What followed was the longest night of Gareth's life. The fighting moved from street to street, building to building, as the dead poured through the breached walls in ever greater numbers. The defenders fell back step by step, making the corpses pay for every yard of ground. Gareth lost track of how many dead he'd killed. His hammer grew slick with dark blood and bits of brain matter. His arms ached from the constant swinging, and his lungs burned from the smoke that filled the air. Around him the town burned as the fighting spread fires from building to building. By midnight, the defenders had been pushed back to the town square. Perhaps 50 men remained of the original garrison, plus a handful of armed civilians. They formed a rough circle around the fountain at the square's center, facing outward toward the masses of dead that pressed in from all sides. "Is this it?" asked one of the younger guards, his voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "This is it," Captain Hendricks confirmed. "We've given them a fight they won't forget." But even as he spoke, Gareth could see more dead pouring into the square. They came from every street and alley, their numbers seemingly endless. The final assault was about to begin. That was when Gareth made his own decision, one that would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. He looked around at the exhausted defenders, at the terrified civilians, at the children who'd been caught in the town when the attack began. All of them would die in the next few minutes. All of them would rise again as enemies, unless someone prevented it. Without warning, Gareth broke from the circle and charged into the mass of dead. His hammer swept left and right, crushing skulls and clearing a path through the corpses. Behind him, he heard Hendricks shouting his name, but he didn't look back. He fought his way across the square, drawing the attention of every corpse in sight. They turned toward him like flowers following the sun, shambling after this new source of prey. And as they did, they moved away from the oiled circle and the defenders within it. Gareth's hammer finally broke under the strain, its handle snapping as he brought it down on a particularly thick skull. He drew his dagger and kept fighting, stabbing and slashing at the dead that pressed around him. But there were too many, and he was only one man. They bore him down at last, grey hands grasping at his arms and legs. He felt teeth sink into his shoulder, then his neck. Pain flared through his body as the dead began to tear him apart. But his sacrifice had given the others precious seconds. As Gareth fell beneath the wave of corpses, he heard Captain Hendricks give the order, "Light the oil!" Flames roared to life around the circle of defenders. The dead closest to the fire were caught in the inferno, their dried flesh burning like tinder. The heat was so intense that even the corpses farther away were driven back. Gareth's vision was fading as blood loss and shock took their toll. But through the gathering darkness, he could see the flames reaching toward the sky like the prayers of the dying. The defenders would die as they had chosen, as human beings, not as monsters. And in their deaths, they would deny the enemy perhaps 50 new recruits for their army of the damned. It wasn't victory, but it was something. A final act of defiance in the face of an enemy that knew no mercy, no fear, no doubt. As consciousness slipped away, Gareth's last thought was of the forge in Millhaven, where he'd learned to shape steel with hammer and fire. He'd been a good apprentice, Master Aldrich had said. He'd learned his lessons well. The flames consumed the square, leaving only ash and twisted metal, where once there had been a town. The dead wandered through the ruins for a time, then moved on toward the south, following the roads toward new victims. But their numbers were no greater than when they'd arrived. Redbridge had fallen, but it had not fed the enemy. In the end, that was the most any of them could have hoped for.